Heir to the Empire is unfortunately no longer canon. But that doesn't mean that we should still ignore it or that it should not be read. And I'm going to talk about it because when the new canon got announced, a lot of people were upset. A lot of people were really bummed that these wonderful novels were no longer canon. And the one story that really seemed to come up as like being like, why is this no longer canon, is Heir to the Empire. So, out of curiosity, both from hearing stuff online about it and from wonderful things about this one of my friends, I decided to check it out, and I just finished it today, and I thought I'd review it for one thing, just to keep it alive, and more importantly, I thought it would be fun because, like, there's a bunch of people out there who've probably read this story a million times or have grown up with it, and I'm reading these stories for the first time, so I thought it would be fun to just sort of just go through and say, here's the thoughts of someone who's just experienced it. So I'm real quick just gonna sum up what happens, just in case you don't remember, if you're reading this and if for some reason you're reading this before seeing it. So it's 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, and the roles are kind of reversed. The rebels are on top, and they're trying to establish a new republic. And in an interesting role reversal, the Empire is now in the bottom. They're sort of the rebellion. They're sort of like on the edge, trying to fight their way back. And leading this movement is this really intelligent villain called Grand Admiral Thrawn. He's basically trying to assemble a fleet, gather forces, and this involves the recruitment of, along building a fleet. He also gets the help of this Jedi clone named Joris Sabaoth. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But in exchange, and basically his connection to the Force is basically supposed to strengthen the resolve of his fleet. Kind of like in KOTOR or Bastila and her battle meditation. But Joris, in order to... He's only helping Thrawn if he's given access to Luke and Leia and their children. And that pretty much sets the plot into motion as Leia, Han, and Chewie, who are out establishing the New Republic, they get captured by their attempts made to capture them, and which forces them to go into hiding and investigate. Leia's takes her to Kashyyyk, where she encounters this creature who used to work for Vader, but now isn't in Leia. That story, I mean, I don't know. I didn't really care for that story much, but basically, now Leia's trying to negotiate with that species. Luke, on the other hand, while Thrawn attempts to capture him, Luke gets caught by Talon Karrde, who ultimately has to wind up siding with the rebels. And while Luke, meanwhile, encounters Mara Jade, who's a very interesting character I'm going to get into a bit. But at the end, Luke escapes. Thrawn, he tries to acquire something for new ships for his fleet, and he's forced to retreat. And while Luke's manages to escape from him. And I'm sorry if that was a rough summary, but I just want to do it. So, now that I've finished summarizing, let me tell you what I thought of it. And that was really good. This left a way better taste in my mouth after reading A New Dawn, which, don't read A New Dawn. It's nothing special. Even if you're curious about it, it adds nothing to the show. I mean, that's not true. I mean, it fleshes out Kanan, but I feel like the comics are doing a better job of that. But first off, I really like the way the story is going. This really feels like a really nice continuation of it. The rebels trying to establish order and cleaning up the Empire, and the Empire trying to fight their way back. But I like how, while we still have the Rebels and Empire dynamic, it feels different. Again, there's that very clever role reversal where, again, the rebels, they're on top now. And the Empire, they're sort of the rebellion. They're small, they don't have as many resources. Like, the fact that they can't even just send out stormtroopers everywhere, they have to be selective of where they send them out, is really cool. And it just prevents this from becoming a simple rebels versus Empire. And I like how they all have their various struggles. The rebels, they're struggling to sort of establish their new government and maintain it. And the Empire, you really feel the sense that they're sort of outrun. Like, they have to be smart about where they attack and where, and they have limited resources. So, because, like, yeah, I mean, just having them still fight the Empire would make this feel lazy. But the fact that the way they set it up, it feels like a different battle than the ones we were seeing in the original trilogy, and I really like that. And I do, and it sort of has this Game of Thrones layout where, not just in how this feels like one part of a bigger story, but how we have all these branching storylines, although unlike Game of Thrones where it seems to diverge more and more, here it ties a lot to, most of it ties together. And holding the story together are some really good characters who I'm going to dive into a bit. We're going to start with the original trilogy characters. First off is Luke, who I really liked what Luke's story is. Like, they found a nice way to continue his story and still give him some sort of interesting conflict about what it means to be a Jedi, discovering his new Force powers, growing, like, dealing with the fact that he's the only Jedi. He's like, he has to, like, basically bring the Jedi back, and it's a really interesting arc all around. And it also just leads to a lot, like, this whole novel, in terms of the original trilogy, there's, like, certain things where I'm like, oh yeah, we have to deal with that now. Like, Leia is Luke's sister, so she's tapping into her Force powers. I'm like, oh yeah, right, they were probably going to have to deal with that. So I like Leia sort of exploring her Jedi powers. I like how she still really doesn't have a grasp on it. Like, she can sense stuff, and she kind of uses lightsaber, but she still doesn't have a full handle on it, and it'll be interesting to see if she has some sort of arc over this, but I do like it. But at the same time, I felt like her storyline was a little weak. Like, it felt a little disconnected from the other storylines, and it didn't get as much focus. Like, she goes to Kashyyyk a bit, and she gets, like, 2 or 3 chapters of her hiding on Kashyyyk, and it's not that interesting or long. I mean, hopefully it'll go somewhere interesting in the second book, but as of right now, that's the weaker of the two. It's relevant, and Leia's character lends herself nicely to getting more to do, but I feel like it wasn't that interesting. Han and Lando's story was fun, although it was great to see these guys hang out, be friends. And it was kind of, it wasn't my favorite aspect of the story, but it wasn't my least favorite. I mean, they're fun characters, but at times it just felt like they were there because they were there in the other movies, and they really didn't have any sort of character development or arc. I mean, it was fun to see him, and glad they're there, but at times it felt like we were just sort of giving them things to do. And, you know, it's sort of like Plinkett touched on this in his Force Awakens review for the second trailer, but it does feel like at times that we should have just killed Han off in Empire. So now let's talk about the new characters, and I really liked all these characters. I like how they weren't afraid to just throw us a bunch of characters. Not like A New Dawn where they just added characters, most of which I really doubt are going to go anywhere. But really cool characters that are clearly going to go somewhere. We have Thrawn, who's a great villain, by the way. I love this character. Like, it would have been so easy just to find another evil Sith Lord, just give us someone who's very similar to Vader. But they didn't do that. I really like it. He's super smart and intelligent in regards to strategy. Like, he's always planning ahead. He's not stubborn. Like, he knows when to bail out, when to retreat, when it's worth losing something. And he's able to, like, constantly figure stuff out like Han Leia. And I also like how he's also understanding. Like, there's that great moment when Luke gets away and one of the officers is like, oh shit, this is the part where he gets strangled. Thrawn's like, it's okay. You weren't trained for this scenario, you weren't prepared for it, it was completely off guard, completely understandable. And I really like that. Like, it's one of the problems I have with Rebels on the Inquisitors is that the villains aren't really that interesting. They seem a little too similar to villains we've already seen. I really kind of wish the show would just sort of create characters that we could relate to. But yeah, really love this character. I also like his second in command, sort of like the Grand Admiral Thrawn character, Paleon. And he sort of feels like the relatable character. Like, if Thrawn is Sherlock, this guy's Watson. Like, he's the relatable character who we can see what he sees, knows what he knows. And then we have Mara Jade, who's probably my favorite one of the, again, another character I really like. I mean, discarding her backstory, which, and at times it just feels like a bit of an excuse just to stretch. Like, do you honestly expect me to believe she was there in Return of the Jedi? I mean, I'll have to go back and rewatch it and see if it's like, wait, is that Mara Jade? But it just felt like a bit of a stretch just to give her an excuse to hate Luke. And then the whole Emperor's Hand thing, just to explain why we've never heard of her. But at the same time, it did lead to an interesting character. I like how she's not really they sort of put her in this, she's a villain, but there's sort of this in-between spot where she's a hero villainess, and she's sort of trying to find her way, and I really like, she has to kill Luke, but at the same time she has to save him, and I really liked her whole story, and I really liked how her whole dynamic with Luke and Mara Jade, and I really am looking forward to seeing that relationship developed in future books, although I know where it ultimately ends up. But knowing that, I was all the more surprised when I saw where it started out. And the other characters aren't really that developed. And there's this Jedi character, but we really don't get that much of him. And he seems like an interesting character, but again, I don't really feel like I got to see enough of him in the book to a point where I could really talk about him adequately. Hopefully he'll get more to do in the later books. There's Talon Karrde, who Mara Jade's working for in this book, and I do like how he's sort of like neutral, like he's in between, and he sort of gets caught up with the rebellion. Like, okay, in this situation, it's probably, I feel sort of obligated as a host to help the rebels. And while this isn't a character, I do like this edition of the Samaria, whatever they're called. It's a really clever device to sort of like bring weaken the Jedi, because it's like, yeah, I mean, like, what's to stop Luke from slashing Thrawn when he finds him or something? It's like, well, there's this anti-Jedi device, which does its job. I really like the setting of the story. Like, I feel like I'm in Star Wars. Like, when we go to Dagobah, I feel like I'm in Dagobah. And there's a cinematic quality. Like, which is surprising, because after reading Game of Thrones, like, I honestly thought to myself, like, okay, like, no matter what I read, the writing's going to always be weak, but it's still pretty good. I mean, I would have liked a bit more detail and description on some of the creatures and locations, but it still feels like I'm there. Like, there's this moment, like, when we first meet Luke in this novel, and he's on Coruscant, which I love how Phantom Menace used Coruscant in the prequels rather than making up another capital planet. That was a really nice way of having some continuity. Like, it's like, oh, we need a capital planet. Here's one in the U. Let's use that. So now there's not this whole run-in where Phantom Menace contradicts the Empire, but I digress. But anyway, when Luke wakes up, I'm like, I can almost visualize this in a movie, and it was really impressive. I mean, my only problem with this story, I mean, was that the nature of it, which is that it was a setup. Like, it's more just introducing the characters and the setting and laying the groundwork, and I mean, it was good at making engagement. Like, there was a lot of fun action, good character dynamics, but ultimately I walked away feeling like this was just the introduction of the setup. It's like setting the table for the rest of it. I mean, it was still a good novel on its own right, but I feel like it's sort of like Game of Thrones, where I'm the first Game of Thrones book, where I'm just going to look back at it and feel like it was the setup for a way better story. And hopefully now that we've introduced everything, like, if this were A New Hope, then I hope the next one, Dark Force Rising, is basically the Empire Strikes Back, where Thrawn's going to come back and hit hard and hopefully capture Luke and Leia so we can really get the ball rolling. Like, And yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. It was a really good novel. I'd highly recommend reading it if you haven't already. And yeah, I cannot wait to start Dark Force Rising. So leave your thoughts in the comment below. Like, dislike, subscribe, and this is JStar60, and until next time, may the Force be with you.